So, some major shifts are happening inside Russia's economy, and they're revealing a stark contrast of what's being claimed by Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin versus the realities of what the economy itself and the Russian people are managing and facing as we enter a tough winter. Indeed, the State Duma has passed its new 2026 to 28 budget, and for the first time, we're seeing a brutally honest snapshot of where the Russian economy is heading. A country taxing its own people to pay for this war it is struggling to afford, squeezing businesses to keep the military alive, and quietly admitting that growth is not just stagnating, but largely deteriorating. On paper, this is, of course, a budget. But, as always, it's more looking like a confession, or plenty of concessions, because behind every line, every tax rise, every desperate number is a simple truth. Putin's war machine is eating the Russian economy alive. They may well be having the upper hand on the battlefields, but this is not a sustainable picture. So in this video, I wanted to break down exactly what's in Russia's new wartime budget, what the Kremlin is trying to hide, and why this matters for the next few years, if this war is to grind on, and the sense of deeper vulnerability for Russians rurally and urbanly on the future of their livelihoods and how it could play into Putin's decision-making. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going on? Welcome back to the channel where, if you are new, we cover the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis this time around on the Russian economy, something we revisit on occasion, be it just through my own takes or with, say, Konstantin Samalyov of Inside Russia. But before getting into that, I want to know, do you think that the state of the Russian economy is paramount now, or is the situation on the front lines more important? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, because Russia has passed one of its most consequential budgets since Putin's full-scale invasion. Now, on the surface, you may hear the usual talking points if you follow Russian media or anything like that. Things like sovereignty, import substitution, sanction resistance. But look a little deeper, and different pictures emerge. Slowing growth, collapsing investment, higher taxes, and a government admitting it can't fund the war without raiding the pockets of the most ordinary of Russians, i.e. Putin's biggest supporters. Indeed, this is a moment where economic reality meets political ambition. But maths, as always, is a language that is ubiquitous. It cannot lie. And so let's start with the headline figures for next year, 2026. The Kremlin expects a revenue of about 40 trillion rubles, spending of about 44 trillion rubles. And so that means a deficit of about 3.8 trillion rubles, or about $47 billion. And let's focus on the key point. Nearly 40% of all government expenditure, just shy of about 17 trillion rubles, goes directly to defense and national security. This is still far above pre-war levels and only barely below the insane military spending of the last 2 years. To make this politically palatable, lawmakers have highlighted domestic goodies, 10 trillion rubles for family support, 50 billion rubles for a state-run charity tied to the military, and little gestures to show that the state cares, even though their gas bills and ability for Russians to gain the basic of food is non-existent. And these are, of course, scraps compared to defense. It's not a social budget. It's not a development budget. This is a war budget with a welfare-shaped sort of sticker slapped on the front. And of course, the Kremlin knows that, because when you put so much expenditure into your war efforts, there's very trickle-down effect. There's very little impact and longer-term benefits for the economy, the supply side, and why wartime economies often lead to greater innovation, but that is not felt for a long time because it doesn't have the same real-time effect. There's always a lag time. And one of the biggest issues with the sustainability of this, when Russia is also sanctioned as much as it is, and also relatively isolated from the primary existing financial system, say SWIFT. Of course, it has its support from alternative countries, but it is not as integrated, and therefore economies that were also dealing with conflicts such as the West during the Second World War, they didn't have this additional layer of challenges to manage. So why many people who focus on the war in Ukraine look at the Russian economy as one of the critical shall we say, conflict factors that could determine the longer-term outcome. As to these tax hikes, who's actually going to be paying for them? And it's where this is getting really revealing. To fill the hole left by the sanctions and rather collapsing oil income we've covered many times, the State Duma has passed its largest tax increases Russia has seen in decades. VAT, the tax everyone pays, jumps from 20 to 22%. This, of course, then raises inflation and it hits the poorest hardest. i.e. the rural communities. It also contradicts years of Kremlin rhetoric about avoiding broad-based tax rises. But it, of course, gets worse. The threshold for paying VAT drops from 60 million rubles to 10 million rubles in revenue. That means thousands of small businesses, corner stores, local services all force into a new tax net. Lawmakers openly admit this will strain small businesses, many of whom earn less than 200,000 rubles a month after salaries and costs. Not really more than a couple thousand USD. And on the top of VAT, new levies on betting companies, new corporate obligations, and more businesses brought under the tax regime. Now, economists estimate the package brings in 3 trillion rubles, or $35 billion, almost exactly what the Kremlin needs to plug this deficit. In other words, the government has chosen the simplest path: make the Russian people pay for the war. Not the oligarchs, not state corporations, the ordinary Russians who are not exactly ideal in the situation in the winter. And with that in mind, we've just had a budget in the UK, which many people would argue, well, the West isn't doing well either, and so all this criticism about Russia, but actually look at Britain. And that is a fair point. But Britain's not the one that's going to war with another sovereign state. And it's these sorts of takes where I try to be a balanced, acknowledging, and critical analysis. And if you appreciate that, then do consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It's free, and we're so close to 100,000, I'd love to have you along for the journey. Compare this to history. During Putin's first 2 terms, Russia's economy was rocketing from under 200 billion in 99 to $1.7 trillion in GDP by 2008-9. It was the closest thing Russia ever had to an economic miracle. But today, Russia's GDP is about 2.2 trillion, roughly the same as 10 years ago, 13, before Crimea and the annexation. Growth has stagnated, momentum has disappeared, and that's even before the full-scale invasion in 22. And these are now being reflected in the forecast. Last year, the growth expectation was 4.3%. Now it's 1. And the IMF forecast? 0.5%, 0.6% growth. That is just terrible, regardless of who you're asking. And a senior member of Bank told Reuters that Russia's economy is cooling, down from the 4 to 5 quarters it expected. This is therefore not a booming wartime economy, it's a fatigued one, strained, stretched, and slowly stalling. Putin, of course, insists it's fine. He points to low debt, high spending, stronger than expected performance. But even he has admitted problems with interest rates and investments. A viral video I made in the summer acknowledged this. And the budget for the next 3 years exposes that even more. Russia can't keep up this war without gutting its own economy and relying on foreign entities, namely China and India, who, well, as we know, with Trump's threat of secondary sanctions, is a big issue and could be a unsustainable, inconsistent dependability for the Russians. The budget is essentially a compromise between, therefore, a war camp inside the Kremlin, demanding 8% of GDP for defense, and the more reasonable or rational economists trying to avoid a complete collapse of the economy, even if they do support Putin's war. Economists have got the least inflationary options of tax hikes instead of massive borrowing. War hawks got the money they wanted. But the ones who lost, of course, is the Russian public, will have to shoulder that VAT increase, reduced investments in infrastructure, and falling living standards overall. We've seen a cut of public services, social services across the country. And now Russia is entering a phase of low growth, 1%, 1.3% inflation, around 4%, and very high interest rates. Couple that with declining private demand, a contracting investment environment, and after 3 years of heavy wartime spending, almost 10% of GDP, the government is having to reduce fiscal stimulus. Private investment in 2026 is projected to fall by 0.5 percentage point after raising 3% in the year before. That is the clearest sign of all, that the state is attempting to basically crowd out the private sector. And by 2028, Russia's industrial growth will come overwhelmingly from military-linked industries. This is structural militarization, if you like, not a temporary wartime adjustment. And as I've already made clear, it is a systemic problem because there is no positive feedback loop into different industries, no spillover effect, and, well, a lot of the things that they produce are destroyed. So even though nominal defense spending slightly dipped on paper, the economy remains dominated by military demand. Between 26 and 28, military industrial growth rises steadily, civilian industries stagnate or deteriorate, living standards fall across the board, and the private sector shrinks. Therefore, the Kremlin's message is largely clear. Russia is becoming a permanent war economy, and critically, the government has broken its long-standing promise of no broad tax increases. And they openly admit why? Because it's cheaper to tax the whole population than to borrow for the war. But one of Putin's biggest supporter bases, older generations, rural communities, rely heavily on pension contributions. And if they start picking at those, which they have suggested, that really does put Putin's favorability in question. Now, the Kremlin wants to frame this as a strength, as Russia that has adapted, endured the sanctions, and retooled for long-term confrontation with the West. And of course, the Russians used to hardship, and this kind of rhetoric will resonate. But the reality is the numbers tell a different story. And it's signaling three things. Firstly, it is preparing for prolonged conflict in Ukraine, not a quick victory, not a negotiated settlement, despite what the media will say, and a drawn-out war that drags on. Second, the leadership knows that the easy money is increasingly gone. Oil and gas revenues, once the lifeblood of the Russian state, are being squeezed by those sanctions, price caps, volatile markets, and reduced demand from, say, India and China. And so the Kremlin falls back on the one tool it can always rely on, taxing its own citizens. Thirdly, the political contract inside Russia is changing. For years, Kremlin promised stability in exchange for political obedience. But stability requires consistent growth. It requires investment. It requires rising living standards. And this budget shatters that illusion. It shatters the idea that the Kremlin is able to protect them, provide for them, and that we can give you security and you simply pay for it a bit more. It is a shift from consumer-driven state to a militarized one. And historically, once an economy reaches this point, it rarely turns back and lasts at all. Now, very quickly, let's discuss what this means for the average Russian. A VAT hike from this 20 to 22% doesn't sound like much, but for a household living on 40,000 rubles a month, for example, which is millions of Russian families, mind you, this means higher food prices, utility bills, transport costs, and with inflation officially forecast to fall to 4%. But Russian economists admit it will likely be higher once that new tax regime kicks in. So it's a temporary reprieve. The collapse in investment? Well, when private demand shrinks and interest rates stay high, businesses don't expand, they don't hire, they don't innovate. Russia's central bank has already warned of a labor shortage, partly caused by this mobilization, partly caused by mass immigration, and partly by the systemic demographic decline. Add shrinking private investment, and you get fewer jobs, lower wages, worse services, slower innovation. We get the sense here. We get the idea. It is a compound effect, a negative feedback loop that builds and builds, snowballs. State-linked defense industries, though, continue to grow. Factories producing shells, drones, armored vehicles. These are the only industrial sectors expected to consistently expand over the next 3 to 4 years. In other words, if you're not part of the war economy, your prospects are crap. They're shrinking. This is the classic symptom of a system where war becomes the organizing principle of national life. It's not total mobilization, but it's creeping mobilization in the non-military sense. And the Russian public is aware of this. There's only so many billboards or sentiments to support or run and potentially die for your country that can work. The Kremlin will insist the economy is stable. It will insist the West is the one that is failing. And you'll see that from many pro-Putin rhetorics. But several long-term risks here are baked into the system now. Look for these as we go into the winter and future. Structural stagnation. Russia enters a period of low growth, non-recession, but stagnation. High interest rates, becoming a perma-crisis to control that inflation, but ultimately just elevating issues, killing investment. This military industrialized policy, the defense industries dominating the state's vision of growth, civilians and small, medium enterprises or SMEs will be squeezed out. And then, of course, the demographic collapse, shrinking workforce, higher dependability by older generations, and reduced fertility rates. And, of course, fiscal erosion. With oil revenues, volatile taxes on individuals simply keep growing, putting more pressure on this social contract. Declining foreign investment, sanctions only increasing, Russian economies cannot access global markets, and so import substitution is reaching its limits. Put all of this together, and you get an economy that can continue functioning only by consuming itself. And, well, we know what happens if you start eating away at yourself. All of this, therefore, leads back to the critical geopolitical emphasis. What about the war in Ukraine? The budget shows that Russia is digging in for this war of attrition. It does not mean the Kremlin is about to collapse. I want to make that very clear. Others will say that, but we can talk about terminal cancer or as a metaphor, right? That you are terminal. Doesn't mean you're on the verge tomorrow, but you are in a perpetual state of decline. Every additional year of war hurts Russia more than it hurts Ukraine's Western-backed economy, although Ukraine has its own issues to deal with, and no one on this channel of a reasonable mind would deny that. But the West, as a collective, has deeper pockets. The biggest question is Trump's willingness to sustain the situation and Ukraine's economy. So it's more a case of what happens first. Support for Ukraine deteriorates and the economy there implodes, or Russia's internal situation and its economy implodes. It tells us the war, therefore, overall is far from over, and the reality of Putin's goals long term, and why, regardless of what others like to claim, you cannot trust him and you mustn't. My name is Pyotr Kurzin. I'm a mixture of Russian and English, and I try to bring this nuanced approach to not just the war in Ukraine or Russia's situation and its relationship with NATO and the West, but also international issues, be that in Africa, South China Sea with Taiwan and China, and everything else in between. But we'll see you all in the next one, and you can find links in the description below if you'd like to buy me a coffee or join as a member or patron. See you next time.